Dear students, this module titled as Historical Decline in Fertility in Industrial Countries is an important module in which we will be discussing about the fertility trends in developed countries, the transition that exists from high fertility to low fertility, issues related to baby boom, and the recent fertility patterns with a special focus on industrial countries. If you look at, as you all know, fertility is the driving force of population growth in the world today. Mortality rates are relatively lower around the world with all the historical standards, though exceptions exist. And if you look at during the 1980s, the total fertility rates in most of the advanced societies fell below 2.1 children, which is the replacement level per woman, as brought out by Van der Kaa in 1987, a level known as replacement fertility. 2 children to replace their parents and the remaining fraction to compensate for those who will remain childless or die before the end of their reproductive lives is an important number, 2.1, which is usually called as replacement level. And if we take that as a basis, and if we look at most of the countries, how they have performed in fertility level is an important issue, and also it has a tremendous influence which has contributed immensely in reducing these fertility levels because of various developmental indicators that these countries have experienced over a period of time. Within the next decade, subsequent to 1980s, an important proportion of southern and eastern European countries, for instance Russia, which has reached fertility rates below 1.3 children per woman, which is a level known usually as the lowest low fertility. Very low fertility poses challenges for academics and also for policy makers alike, as shrinking and aging populations jeopardize economic growth and threaten the sustainability of pay-as-you-go welfare systems. The current birth rates indicate that at present the industrial countries have very low birth rates. This was not always so, for at one time these same countries had very high birth rates. It would therefore be interesting to trace the course of fertility decline in these countries. Even in the 18th century, most of the developed countries, which are now famously contributing for low birth rates, had experienced crude birth rates as high as around 40. Looking firstly at the crude birth rates, that is the number of births per thousand population, not taking account of the age and sex composition of the population, in the majority of agrarian societies outside the Europe region before 1950s, these were usually in the range of between 45 to 55 per thousand population. That is why the crude birth rate was very high in these countries and those periods of time. A rate of 45 per thousand was not unusual, despite the fact that more than half the females were aged under 15 years of age, and we can easily realize that those countries at that point of time had very high birth rates, and also the proportion of children in the age composition was also at a very high level. The rates in historical Europe were probably not as high as this, but by the middle of the 19th century, West European populations had a crude birth rates of about 35 per thousand, and they started showing its reduction over a period of time. Up to the middle of 18th century, these which rates are probably normally higher of the order of 40 per thousand, as in 18th century France is an example how this high birth rate was the norm during those periods of time. In England, for instance, the rates were lower. It has now been established that during the second half of the 17th century and early 18th century, crude birth rates were well below the expected 45 per thousand of a normal pre-industrial population. If we look at France, before Industrial Revolution, its crude birth rate was 37, and in Sweden, for instance, the crude birth rate was in the range between 32 and 35. In Norway, it was between 29 and 33. Thus, in the 18th century, Russia and Eastern Europe had a very high birth rates than Northern and Western Europe. Look at the case of United States. The total fertility rate in the United States after World War II peaked at about 3.8 children per woman in the late 1950s, and by the year 1999, it was as low as 2 children. The fertility rate of the total US population was just below the replacement level of about 1.9 children per woman in 1979 itself. However, the fertility of the population of United States is below replacement among those native born and above replacement among immigrant families, most of whom come to the US from countries with high fertility than that of the US. That way, if you look at the United States, there is a huge difference in the fertility level, and one extreme you can see how they have a below replacement, especially among the native borns, and above replacement among immigrant families, and also these immigrants who have come mainly from high fertility regions to US. However, the fertility rates of immigrants to the US have been found to decrease sharply in the second generation, correlating with improved education and income. These immigrants, after entering into the US, also adopt small family size, and that way, with improved their education level and also the income level, when it improved, they tried to reduce their family size, and that way TFR was found to be very low even among the immigrants. As of the beginning of 2016, there are 59.8 births per thousand women during the reproductive span of 15 to 44, which is the lowest number since records have been kept since 1909. Look at Russia, for instance. In the later half of the 19th century, the crude birth rate in Russia was almost 50. In 1913, it was around 47 per thousand population. The average total fertility rate in European Union is calculated at 1.58 children per woman in the latest of 2015. Most of the southern European countries have very low total fertility rate. For instance, Portugal as low as 1.31, Cyprus 1.32, Greece 1.33, Spain 1.33, Italy 1.35. Poland also has a very low total fertility rate of 1.32. France has the highest total fertility rate at 1.96, followed by Ireland of 1.92, Sweden 1.85, UK 1.80, and Denmark as low as 1.71. When we look at the other non-European Scandinavian countries, they also had a very high total fertility rate, which was relatively at lower levels. For instance, in Iceland, it was 1.80. In Norway, it was 1.72. In the non-European post-Soviet states, in 2016, if we look at, Russia has a total fertility rate of 1.61, Moldova 1.56, Ukraine 1.54, and Belarus as low as 1.48. The important aspects when we look into as immigration of young adults from Eastern Europe to the West have aggravated the demographic problems of those countries. People from countries such as Moldova, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, they are particularly moving abroad, and this also has a tremendous effect on the levels of fertility that they experience. The transition from high to low fertility did not begin for all these countries at the same time. It's a huge variations that are noticed in these countries. For instance, France was the first to experience a decline in fertility when birth rate started declining way back of 1830s. Ireland was next, with the declines initiated in the 1840s. Other European countries followed in between, with the declines in fertility settings in at different points of time in the 19th and 20th centuries. The timing of the turnaround varied from country to country. For instance, when you look at the United States performance, the turnaround occurred in the mid-1970s, whereas for the country like Norway, it happened in the early 80s. In Italy, it was in the early 1990s. That way, within the European region, a huge variations in the fertility levels not only occurred in reducing the fertility, but also at the point of time when it happened, also significantly varied across these countries. Throughout the 20th century, the fertility rate has generally fallen as economic prosperity has risen, sometimes far below the replacement rate in some of the world's most highly developed nations such as Japan, South Korea, Germany, Spain and Italy. So that is why we can say that as economic prosperity has been attained in a country, one of the important reductions that occur is in the area of fertility, and that is widely noticed in the highly developed nations of the world, like in the countries like Japan, South Korea, Germany, Spain and Italy. Thus, it is evident that the birth rates of these countries have fallen significantly, though the tempo has been different across these countries. Now, look at the fertility transition. The resistance to the notion of replenishing their populations through immigration. Some countries such as Sweden and Italy, they have become so concerned about their stubbornly low fertility rates that they have tried offering women financial incentives to have more babies without significant success. This is one of the important aspects that we need to understand, that when the transition occurs, then it becomes too difficult to revise it and to see that the low fertility will again come back to moderate or high fertility levels. And these are some of the countries like Sweden and Italy, which have clearly shown that irrespective of incentives that are proposed by the government for women or couple in general, they continue to adopt low fertility in the presence of these incentives also. To explore whether economic development is necessarily linked to falling fertility, Kohler and his colleagues examined fertility trends during 1975 and 2005 by taking 37 countries which are most of the developed countries. They used a measure developed by the United Nations known as the Human Development Index, HDI, which combines income data with other measures of advancement such as longevity and educational levels. The fertility rates did tend to decline as a nation's Human Development Index rose. The analysis clearly showed, especially when it is listed, the analysis showed that out of 26 countries, out of which 18 of these countries have crossed a certain threshold of development, that is, in a Human Development Index of at least 0.9, that fertility rates began to rise again. The decline of fertility is one of the most fundamental social changes that happened in human history. It is therefore especially surprising how very rapidly this transition can indeed happen in these societies. A century ago, it took the United Kingdom 95 years, and the United States 82 years to reduce fertility from more than 6 to less than 3. This is a pattern that we see often in development. That is, those countries that first experience social change take much longer for transitions than those who catch up later. It has been shown in some of these countries. For instance, countries that were catching up increased life expectancy much faster, they reduced child mortality more quickly, and they were able to grow their incomes much more rapidly. There is a distinct contrast between the highest rates, that is TFR over 2.0, in some of the European countries like Denmark, France, Iceland, Ireland, Norway, and even in a country like Turkey, which are mainly in Western and Northeastern Europe. And the lowest rates of TFR, less than 1.54, have been experienced by those countries which are mainly located in Southern and Eastern European region, like countries like Belarus, Greece, Italy, Russia, Spain, and the Ukraine. If we look at the transition in the fertility level, in 2005, the European total fertility rate was only 1.31 to the range of 1.50 in 15 countries and less than 1.30 in 10 countries. Thus, rates in some countries approach the replacement level, while other countries fall far below replacement levels. It's challenging to determine whether these differences can be attributed to any country level factors. At the beginning of the 20th century, the crude birth rates in these developed countries have varied considerably, and it was very significant that the levels are so vast in most of these countries. In France, the decline in marital fertility began in 1800 and preceded the marital decline in other European countries by about 70 years. An alternative explanation for the early decline in French fertility is also significant to notice. The French decline is generally regarded as differing from the decline in other European countries only in timing, and the decline in all these countries is attributed to the innovative use of modern fertility control methods, which once introduced were widely and rapidly accepted. At one end, we have seen country like France, which had birth rate of 21.2 per thousand population, and Ireland of 23.1 per thousand population way back during 1900 to 1904. At the other end, we noticed countries like USSR as high as 47.2 births out of 1000 population, Bulgaria 40.7 births, and Romania 39.6 per thousand population, with high crude birth rates during the same period. These are all contrasting in the fertility transition across these countries. By 1970, crude birth rates in all countries in Europe except Ireland, Romania, and Poland, they were far below 20 per thousand population. The crude birth rates for Argentina was 22.9, New Zealand 22.1, and Australia was as low as 20.6 births per thousand population, and they were all above 20 but below 25. The range of crude birth rates for developed countries has thus shown to be substantially narrowed, and in 1974, nearly 66% of the developed countries had birth rates as low as below 18 per thousand population. The pattern of fertility has also become somewhat homogeneous, with a greater concentration of fertility in the younger, reproductive age groups. Very important, significant way of analyzing the fertility transition is the stage of baby boom. At the end of World War II, it brought out a baby boom in many countries, especially in Western ones. The baby boom started to decline as birth rates in the United States started to decline in year 1958, though the boom would only grind to a halt 3 years later in 1961, that is 20 years after it began. There is some disagreement as to the precise beginning and ending dates of the post-war baby boom, but it is most often agreed to have begun in the years immediately after the war, though some place it earlier at the increase of births during the period 1941 to 1943. In countries that had suffered heavy war damage, displacement of people was significant, and post-war economic hardships experienced, such as countries like Germany and neighboring country like Poland, the boom began years later. In May 1951, Sylvia Porter, a columnist from the New York Post, used the term boom to refer to the phenomenon of increased births in post-war America. In the United States, demographers usually used mid-1946 to mid-1964, although the US birth rate began to shoot up in 1941 and to decline after 1957. By 1958, the United States population increase was back to the pre-depression increase rate of about 1.5% per year. Some sources place the beginning as early as 1944, or according to Strauss and Howe, it happened in 1943. Many European countries, Australia and New Zealand also experienced a baby boom. In some cases, the total fertility rate was almost doubled. The American birth model, conceived by demographer Frank Notistian, was punctuated by the end to the upsurge in births and a return to pre-war levels. In many European countries, the first year of the post-World War II baby boom was the year 1946, but in Germany, the first year was the year 1955. In Finland, the largest birth rate was and in September 1945. Japan had two separate baby booms. The first one started in 1947, the second one in 1971. Prior to World War II, mortality rates in Europe and America were on a general decline due to improved nutrition and medicine, and a surge in births were previously not experienced at such a large scale. Baby boom years for other countries regarded for having a baby boom are as follows: France in 1946 to 1974, United Kingdom 1946 to 1974, Finland 1945 to 1950, Germany experienced baby boom during 1955 to 1967, Sweden 1946 to 1952, Denmark 1946 to 1950, Netherlands 1946 to 1972, Ireland 1946 to 1982. Like that, countries like Hungary 46 to 57, Iceland 1946 to 1969, New Zealand 1946 to 1961, Australia 1946 to 1961, Japan, as we saw at 2 points of time, during 1947 to 1949 and again in 1971 to 1974. Fertility trends in Canada is interesting. They have been started declining since the peak of the baby boom in the late 1950s. The period total fertility rate was almost 4.00 births per woman in 1959, reached a low of 1.51 in 2000, and currently it stands at 1.61. The decline was greatest during 1960s and then slowed considerably, and Canada's TFR has been fairly stable since the 70s. The full story of Canadian fertility is not in this dramatic decline, however, but rather in the variation across provinces. Today, 46% of the world's population lives in countries with low levels of fertility, where women have fewer than 2.1 children on average. Low fertility countries now include mainly all of Europe and North America. In Europe and North America, where fertility was already relatively low by 1970 to 75, the postponement of childbearing has led to an increasing mean age at childbearing, and that in conclusion we can say that the experience of fertility decline in developed countries is complex in understanding various factors. Several interacting and overlapping economic and social factors have immensely responsibly contributed for transition from high to low levels of fertility, and it follows therefore no single factor can be held responsible for the decline of fertility, and multiple factors have immensely contributed for each of these countries at different points of time, but overall they all have experienced from high fertility to low fertility, and also in this regard baby boom has immensely contributed as one of the major factors in this decline, and that's why fertility transition was highly successful in most of the industrial countries, especially in Europe, USA and also in Australia.